listening to the Pasco Podcast with Dan Biles.
I'm Dan Biles. Welcome to our second episode of Pasco Podcast. In this series, we'll be discussing leadership and public service. Now, first, we'd like to thank our sponsors, the 540,000 people who live, work, and play in Pasco County, as represented by the Board of County Commissioners. It's through their trust and empowerment of our workforce and leadership team that we are able to bring you this podcast. We created this podcast to help public servants build leadership skills and leverage them for success by sharing the experiences of our peers. Now, join us today for our second episode. We have, we have Erik Breitenbach, the Assistant County Administrator for Internal Services, and Robert Bob Goehrig, Director of the Office of Management and Budget. Now, as we get started, can we just tell us a little bit about yourself? Let the people listening or watching kind of give us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. You want to go?
Go ahead.
So, Erik Breitenbach, as you said, I'm an engineer by schooling. I'm a father of two children, an 18-year-old boy, a 13-year-old girl. And so when I'm not working here, I had a boss early on that said, I work to live life. And so I focus heavily on those two. Prior to coming to Pasco County, I spent 20 years in the Navy, using my engineering degree, helping to build and maintain bases around the country and a little around the world. And so I use that experience heavily. We'll get into it a little later. It heavily influences how I am today. But,
All right, cool. Thank you.
Hello. As Erik said, he spent 20 years in the Navy. I spent only 6, so sometimes he calls me a quitter, right? So,
yeah.
So I moved to Florida with my family in 2007 when my wife let it be known that she had scraped the ice and snow off her windshield for the very last time. So we moved to Coral Springs, which is in South Florida, down near Fort Lauderdale. And there I was the Director of Budget, Strategy, and Communication. So I got paid by the letter. And so, of course, I was the budget director there, but I was also in charge of the strategic planning efforts and performance measurement and all the things that went along with that. But at the same time, just for fun, I was also the director of the communications and marketing department. And so from that, I came to Pasco County in 2015. So I've been here nearly 5 years. Came here in 2015 to be the budget director.
Okay. So you came here in 2015. That's about the time.
Yeah, I got here in 2014.
Okay.
As the facilities director, coming straight off of engineering for the Navy and building and maintaining their bases. When I was retiring, I thought, well, either a college campus or another local. I knew I wanted to stay in the private local government or government sector. I didn't want to go work for a big, one of these big companies because a lot of times I wasn't interested in making profits. It was still about service, right? And so whether it's a college campus or somewhere where there's a defined footprint, like a base, the county can be considered a base to me. It's a defined footprint, and you're responsible for, at the time, building and maintaining buildings, and instead of helicopters or runways, it was courthouses and libraries and parks, buildings. But buildings are buildings.
Right. So, tell us kind of a little bit about your leadership philosophy. How do you lead your teams?
Sure. In the Navy, there's a saying that driving the bridge, and to explain that on the ship, the ship is driven from the bridge, and that's why the captain is there. And 2 decks down from the bridge is the Combat Information Center, where you have much lower level people who are monitoring different screens that have inputs from radar, sonar, satellites, and things like that. And so when the ship is operating in a restricted environment or low visibility or something like that, these very low-level folks are the ones who are calling the captain on the bridge and telling him the course, speed to go. So even though the captain is still the leader of this ship, it's very low-level people that are giving the orders and setting the course for the ship. So the moral of that story is that to be a leader, you don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to know everything about the operation. So instead, the leader's job is to set that vision. Where are we going long term? How are we going to get where we're going to go? Set that direction and then empower your folks to figure out a way to get there. And so as the leader, you don't have to have all the answers to say, first we're going to do this, then we're going to do that. So it's really empowering your folks and then setting up an environment, a safe environment that allows them to really reach their potential and be creative in finding different ways to come up with solutions.
Okay.
You use the shipboard analogy. Very similar leadership philosophy, but I use a different lexicon, and I like to think of it as downfield blocking for the team. My role as a leader is to set the conditions, and then remove obstacles for the real stars to perform. Like you talk about the people 1 or 2 decks down in a ship. I was never at sea, although I was in the Navy. I was at sea for like 5 days, which nice. Go figure that, right? So I don't really have those experiences to draw from, but I like sports a lot, and so I look at the sports analogy of the people on the team who are on a football team who don't get a lot of glory, but really, if you watch and understand football, determine who wins or loses. It's the guys in the trenches, the downfield blockers. The guy who catches the ball and runs for a touchdown. The cameras are on them, but what they're not seeing is the leader, which go figure in internal services. I prefer to be behind the scenes, but the leader is out there in front blocking so that touchdown can happen. And so my philosophy kind of revolves around that is you identify your core set of values, which maybe I think we may get into a little, but it's later on, but it sets that mentality. And so to me, the philosophy is the mentality of downfield block and equip and set your teams up for success.
Okay. Yeah. So you mentioned, commander's intent is what the Army calls it, right?
Yeah,
Commander's
Navy
intent.
Navy too. Yeah.
And now I'm Air Force guy, so I'm kind of outnumbered today, and we're talking about an Army concept.
Yeah, right.
So get that, figure that. And so it's a, kind of the, here's a vision, here's where we want to be, and then you let the smart people kind of figure out how to get there, right?
Right.
And then remove the obstacles that they come across that they can't remove themselves.
Exactly.
So,
and as a leader, you shouldn't be afraid to hire smart people. I have
Shouldn't
a whole
be.
team of people that's smarter than me.
Right. Right. Well,
Right.
True.
He said right.
True.
Well, hey, I hope my budget director is smarter than me with respect to budget, right? So, yeah, well, and it goes, and I don't know who said the quote about it, if I'm the smartest person in the room, I'm in the wrong room.
Yeah.
Right?
That's good.
Yeah.
So as you look back on your career, at what point did you say, you know what, I think I can do it, or I'd like to lead others? I've seen other people do it. I'd like to lead others. At what point did that kind of, formulate in your mind, and then how did you go about kind of starting that?
Sure.
For me, it was my 3rd tour in the Navy.
Okay.
Yeah, the first couple of tours, I had a job as a maintenance, keeping maintenance of buildings on a base well, and then I moved to another one where I was, running projects, doing projects, and then it was the 3rd tour where, not by necessarily my choice, but I was pushed into a position of, okay, I'm responsible for, as a company commander, I'm responsible for a company of 120-ish or so people, and I was learning by fire. The Navy had some training skills, and whether I knew it and grew up knowing it, I didn't actively think about it. It was you graduate from college, for me anyway. You go to your first job. Navy moves you to the second job. 3rd job is really where they started to get pushed into seeing the value of working with other people. Up until that point, it had been, I'm responsible for making sure this gets doing the maintenance. I'm responsible for the construction. Now there's a distinct shift into, I'm not responsible for doing it. I'm responsible for making sure it gets accomplished, and I have to work with and rely on a team of people to do it. And man, is that rewarding. I coined a phrase, I called it CB magic. So I was in a construction battalion, or CBs, in that 3rd tour, and just setting the conditions right and then stepping back and watching what what your team can do you get that sense of reward and say, hey, I can do this, and 2, wow, that's powerful. And I wanted to learn how to be the best, not necessarily leader, but the best and most effective person at that job at the time, which then evolved into, okay, this is really about leadership.
Right.
So yeah, at that point in time, I was thrust into it. I didn't know it. Only after looking back, 6-9 months later, or maybe even a couple of years later, that I see, this is where I belong. This is the right thing for me. This is where I get that self-drive, self-satisfaction out of.
Right. Okay.
Sure. Yeah, for me it was I was working for the federal government at the time in the State Department, and I had endured a series of really lousy supervisors, and I thought to myself, if they can do it, certainly I can't do any worse. And so at that point I decided that perhaps the leadership was kind of where I needed to go.
Okay.
I got pretty lucky. I didn't encounter the lousy supervisor until maybe 4th or 5th job in to the
You are
Navy.
lucky.
Yeah, I got pretty lucky along the way. But when I saw it, I thought, okay,
Yeah.
that's what not to do.
Yeah.
And, the good thing about being in the Navy is, you're there's a clock that stops.
Exactly.
At some point, you are going to rotate on to another job. You're not stuck you're not in prison for forever working for a horrible supervisor. So just, okay, I can gut it out, and let me just take the lessons of what not to do and use that to complement my suite of tools as I move forward.
Yeah, because often you can learn just as much from a really bad supervisor
Yes, you can.
as someone that's really good.
Yes,
because as a good supervisor that's a professional, they make it look easy, right? And so you don't really understand what they're doing, the decisions they're making. But if you have a really poor supervisor, you can tell, and you can learn a lot from their mistakes.
Right. Yeah, I think second tour Guam, second commander, because we were on off shifts. I came in 2-year tours off shift. The second guy was horrific. Yeah. So, went from a guy, commander's intent, go do this, and you executed, to somebody that wanted to know step A, step B, and wanted to make the decisions every single point of the way through the process. So, my first as a brand new lieutenant was Lieutenant Colonel. He called us Dragon Slayers. I'll bring you the problem, you solve it. You figure out how to make it happen. So, So as you look back on your career, is there one or two people that have really been like a really big influence that you kind of look back on saying, though that I learned a lot from that person, I kind of pattern my style after that person?
Sure, yeah. If you don't mind, I'll jump in here. When I came to Florida in 2007, went to Coral Springs, and at the time the city manager, Mike Levinson, and I learned a couple of things from Mike. He was a very kind of a hands-on leader, not a micromanager, but he had a really good skill at creating kind of a shared vision. And I never really understood the power of a shared vision until I had worked with Mike. He was able to take some very complex issues and kind of boil them down into a single phrase we were able to energize the workforce, get everyone moving in the same direction with these phrases. And it was powerful the way that, for example, during the recession, he was able to come up with, his phrase was, just because we're in a recession, we've had hard times before. We're not going to, our citizens aren't going to suffer. We're not going to lay off employees. We're not going to cut services. So, Bob, how are we going to do that? Right. So he was the kind that would empower folks. And so at every chance he got, he would communicate that vision, and just to make sure that everyone understood that. And the second thing was he was constantly communicating with everyone in the organization, with the commission, with the residents, businesses, and so on, even to the point where every month we would share the financial statements with employees and go over those financial statements. We would be able to talk to employees about this is where we are versus where we thought we would be. This is kind of the trends we're seeing, and if these trends keep up, this is what's going to happen. And so the upshot of that was that we were able to project 6 months out, so that once something occurred, folks knew it was coming, and so it wasn't a surprise to them. And so because of that open and honest communication style that he had, that really built up a lot of trust with everyone involved.
Okay. Yeah, I like it, what you said there. He was a simplifier.
Yes.
Colin Powell says great leaders are great simplifiers.
Mm-hmm.
We simplify and break things down so people can understand them. So, good.
For me, that third tour in the Navy, I had the fortune of working for one CO. CO is commanding officer. He's now he finished his career as an admiral, and I don't know why. At the time, he was a commander. And a lot of similar things that you talked about. He empowered me, but he trusted me. And he was this guy, Doug Morton was his name. He was responsible for every single thing that happened in that battalion, on the order of 600 people from soup to nuts. And when the time came for the battalion to go from Mississippi to Kuwait to get prepared for the invasion into Iraq, he said, Breitenbach, you're my guy. You're going to take the first element that goes in, and you're going to be entrusted with 150 people and perform this mission, and you're going to go there first. You're going to be the lead element. You're going to represent my battalion. And so at the time, a lot of things were going through my head, all the uncertainties and unknowns. But aside from his individual style, talk about empowerment. That's trust to go halfway across the world into a whole bunch of uncertainties and have the trust in me and the capabilities. And his style was very much like you described. He would simplify things. We use the phrase of polish. I mean, he was, even at the time when he was a commander, he was probably the most polished individual I know. Probably still the most polished individual I know today. And you never thought he was coming at you from a place of malice. He was always for the best intentions. I remember him talking to us once and said, hey, listen, and we've used it here, 99% of the people do good things. And so he's always positive and seek out the good in the things that people are doing. And yes, we have to deal with the unfortunate decisions that some folks make, but we're here to serve and do the mission of the Defense Department, the mission for our nation. We're here to serve. And so empowering, and so that's my personal story of how he empowered me, but I saw him do it with other lieutenants and other chiefs and other members of the battalion. And it had a multiplying effect of we won best battalion in the fleet that year, in large part due to how he led. And so I've tried to model myself after him day in and day out. He wasn't a yeller or a screamer or a pound the table kind of person. But I tell you, early on, he looked at me once and said, Erik, I'm a little disappointed in you in how that happened. And
that was devastating.
It devastated me just by saying I'm disappointed in you. It devastated me for like 4 days. And Doug Morton had the knowledge of me and how I operated, to where you could see me 4 days later, say, Erik, is everything okay? Said, forget about that. It's not that big a deal. You're being too hard on yourself. Pick yourself back up. But he saw that I was still self-beating myself up from hearing that just because he was disappointed.
Right.
And that's the type of person he was. And I said, okay, yeah, there are ways to get people to react without being a yeller and a screamer. It comes back to setting expectations and then honestly telling them when they're meeting expectations or not.
Right.
And so,
yeah, I think those are the words I never wanted to hear from my parents.
Yep,
I'm disappointed in you.
Yes.
Sure.
Exactly. And but that was his style.
Yeah, yell and scream all you want, but I'm disappointed in you was probably the toughest words to hear, right?
Absolutely.
They had an expectation, right? And you wanted to live up to that expectation. Mm-hmm. So as we are talking about this, and we have teams, how do you? And I'm going to come back to the Coral Springs in a minute, but how do you continue to build leadership skills today? How do you today in your personal and professional life continue to build those skills?
Sure. One of the things I do is I'm involved in the Florida Sterling program. So I'm on the exam committee there. I'm a master examiner and a team leader for site visit teams. And part of that role is really is mentoring people who are new in the process and people who will be leaders one day, right? Even though I've been with Sterling for a long time, I'm not always going to be there. So our responsibility is to develop those leaders who will come behind us and make sure that they're prepared. And so one of the things I do is to lead teams and to mentor folks who are new to the process.
Okay.
A couple things professionally. It's kind of formal education. CPM class that I'm taking now. Last session was on systems thinking, which actually I never stopped and looked at the big picture in terms of how systems interact and affect each other. So being able to alter how I particularly look at the world and the organization and individual departments, that professionally is how I'm doing it. Listening, talking, observing. For me, it's self-reflecting on replaying scenarios. Okay, that either went well. Why did it go well? And then reinforcing to myself how that happened, or that didn't go well. What can I learn from it? And so kind of continually reevaluating how you interact with others and interact with the organization on a personal level. I mentioned my kids earlier. It's fine-tuning parenting skills. I mean, everybody that's a parent is a leader. You're kind of thrust into that role when you decide to have kids. And so it has a profound impact on the kids, and so, or on how they grow, their set of values and how they grow up. And so same thing, you get angry at a kid or a child and you go off the handle. Okay, that probably wasn't the smartest thing to do. How can I do that differently in the future? Because it has a multiplying effect on how the child is going to perceive that. And so listening, talking to other parents, discussing scenarios like that, soliciting other thoughts and opinions on how that happened. That personally, that's how I adapt and tweak my leadership style, if you will. It's not so much the philosophy stays the same. It's more styles and how do you handle situational dependence and
the additional tools, if you will,
or styles and toolbox, right? Yeah, but it's
Yeah, and you mentioned always having the replacement ready. I know the military does, or I think some services do it better in the Air Force, where okay, the company commander goes down, well then the XO steps up, and then you go all the way down to the private who can do the same thing. It just they have that ability to continue to lead the organization regardless of what happens with the people in front of them, and so the building the depth, if you will. So
yeah, even in Sterling has 5 levels of examiners, and it's outlined what skills and experiences do you need to move from, say, examiner to senior examiner and so on. And so we've tried to incorporate that into our work at OMB as well. What kind of experiences and skills do we expect our next budget managers or next budget directors to have? And then we try to make sure that those folks that are working with us get those experiences and skills.
Yeah, you touched on a key thing there. There's book knowledge and there's experience. There's no substitute for the experience. So some of the early on, I got thrust into learning by experiential learning, and I think that looking for opportunities to do that builds the best leaders, because it's that self-reflection. How would I have done things differently? Really remains with a person. Much more so than if I read in a textbook or I sit in a class and see something. They retain it, and it tends to have, in my opinion, if you look at it as chiseling a statue, it has the best, the deepest cuts and impression, that experience, experiential leadership lessons that you go through. So kind of trial by fire.
Yeah. So back to Coral Springs a little bit. Y'all went through the Sterling process, and then Baldrige, right? So you have a language at the city, right?
That's correct. Yeah,
we have a language at Pasco County. Yeah. The Navy has a language which is different than the Army's, which is different than the Air Force's, and then there's a Sterling language.
Yes.
So, as leaders, how do you see, whether it's a city or other companies where you've done site visits on, how do they integrate that with their current culture and language so that you don't cause, disruption, if you will, in the process?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, Coral Springs had won the Sterling Award twice, and then it was the first nonprofit local government to win the Baldrige Award in 2007, 2008, something like that. And one of the interesting things is not only in Coral Springs but other organizations that I've examined is that rarely do we talk in terms of Sterling or Baldrige criteria. Really, it's really just the folks who are responsible for implementing that in the leadership team that really knows that it is Sterling or Baldrige. And even here in Pasco, when we talk about Sterling, it makes people nervous. What is a Sterling? Is it something new that I have to learn?
Right.
And so we got away from calling it Sterling into calling it the Pasco management model, just to give folks the idea that this isn't something additional that you're doing. It's just the way that we're going to do business. And so we incorporate that language in everything we do. So we began to use all of our meetings. We began to incorporate the strategic plan into there wherever we could, to incorporate the strategic plan, the business plan, where that was going. We incorporated that kind of language even into the agenda memo with the commission. So if you had an item going to the board, what piece of the strategic plan does this agenda memo address, and so on. So incorporating that language really, if in Coral Springs, if you went down and talked to the frontline folks, they probably wouldn't have told you they never even heard of Sterling. They wouldn't know what it was, but they understood what their job was, and then they could see kind of a direct line how their job impacted the overall mission of the city. And so really it's just communicating how everything fits together, how we try to integrate all the jobs to move the organization forward.
Yeah, so our mission statement, as you will, serving our community, create a better future. So that frontline worker in public works or in parks, the work they do, kind of identifying that bright line, if you will, between the work they're doing, maintaining the ball field,
exactly,
and that serving the community, right?
Right. And so, so we have the goals or the mission of the individual employee, and how does that help them meet the departmental goals? And then the department, how does that help them meet the branch goals? And then finally the organization goals. So there's this line of sight from what I'm doing helps me fulfill my job all the way up through the entire organization.
All right. So, and now Erik is, in your branch, you obviously have, Bob sitting there in budget, but you have a very diverse branch.
Yes.
From fleet to purchasing, fiscal, facilities spread across 740 square miles.
Right.
You're responsible for. How do you take that framework, if you will, and then make sure your teams are kind of aligning and watching the business practices and the leadership style that we want as a county?
There's a lot in that question. So I'll start with the aligning the business practices. Every department does a business plan, and I've moved towards let me back up. The business plan syncs up with the strategic plan, and really is a blueprint, a 1-year blueprint for the work the departments are going to execute and do that year. Excuse me. So I've moved towards sitting down quarterly with each department head and really going through the business plan. Here's what you set out to do this year. How are we doing on that? And so it's a process. To me, on the business side of it, it's a process check, which leads to if they're executing the business plan, if they're paying attention to those that have the more refined metrics, paying attention to the metrics, they should be delivering customer service. In our case, primarily to the other departments, not so much the citizens, because we're second order effect to the citizens. The second piece that I wanted to touch on is on the leadership style. It's constant observation, and you get multiple lines of feedback, whether it's me directly with my peers or other department heads, or in a structured setting, or a more casual setting. You can go seeking out, saying hi, how's it going, with different department heads, all the way up to and including the internal services survey, formal feedback that the organization provides back, so that I sit down with each department head or department leadership team to go through what the rest of the organization is saying on their levels of service, customer service, and how do we focus on improving. That's really what the discussion boils down to, is how do you focus on improving, because nobody's perfect. We just, as an organization, finished that or got the results of the employee engagement survey, right? And so organizationally, moving up and to the right, but if you look at it down, I'd look at it down to the department level, to have those department level discussions with each individual department. We're going to be having those over the next couple of weeks. Some departments have more to work on than others. But I'm a believer in you can't fix everything at once.
Right.
I'll have discussions with, review the results with each department leadership team and talk with them about, okay, here's what the organization says about your department's level of service, or not the organization, sorry, this is how your team feels. How do we affect that? What methods of change? And really facilitate the ideas from within,
Right.
because it helps get the buy-in. I can say you shall do X till I'm blue in the face, but
Right.
that's not, in my opinion, not the most effective way.
Right.
It's just share the information, engage, have a dialogue on what's the best way to change, and then agree on that, and then move forward, and then periodic follow-ups on how things are going.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, if I can just jump on that, a lot of a lot of organizations really are focused on doing things right. And what we do when we're embracing the Sterling criteria is we're trying to do the right things. And so rather than just going out and doing addressing that squeaky wheel, leadership's role here in the Sterling model is really identifying what are the priorities, where are we trying to go, and what are the most important things that we need to accomplish. And so oftentimes you have employees and organizations that are pulled in one direction or another, and it's really leadership's role to keep folks focused, where this is where we're trying to go, this is what we're trying to accomplish, and keep them focused on just addressing what's important to the organization.
So that's where things like the strategic plan that the community and then the board adopted are important. Mission, vision, values of
Exactly.
the organization, right?
Yeah,
Premier County, serving our community,
Absolutely.
create a better future, integrity, respect, service excellence, innovation. Those are important to kind of help guide that.
Absolutely.
So y'all both mentioned a lot. I've heard the word trust a lot in this discussion. And then caring for your people. So trust and caring for your people. So as you're building and identifying and raising new leaders in your team, how do you train them on that trust aspect? I mean, I heard the story about you, Erik, getting sent to Kuwait.
Right.
You know, I remember as a second lieutenant, the colonel called me and said, hey, you're going to go help BOD and heavy equipment pick up an airplane that just crashed. And I'm like, I am? I mean,
Right.
don't know anything. I don't have no clue, right? How to
Right.
do that as a second lieutenant. You know, and so how do we, I mean, we don't have those opportunities, right? We're not going to send somebody, to Kuwait or to go down to the range. How do we build and train our people to trust their people at that front line, that first supervisor who's just become a supervisor? How do we build that depth in the organization?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that
Okay,
one.
no.
Yeah, while the stakes aren't as high as going to Kuwait or your example, there are still opportunities. To me, it's listen, observe, observe how people interact, and you will see the natural leaders, and then trust them by challenging. Give them opportunities on special projects or certain assignments where there's an opportunity to fail, but coach through that it's okay to fail, and say I'm here for you as a resource if you get stuck. Help talk through things, but challenge with to me trust. This is my thoughts on it. The way you trust is you provide opportunities and challenge people to go beyond their comfort zone and their boundaries. I'm trying to think of a recent example. There is a special report, or not report, but a special analysis that needed to be done on impact fees. Give them and make the individual feel important enough to where, hey, I'm trusted with this assignment. Instill a sense of you can do this. You may not have ever done it before. And then report out on the results, and then providing the real-time feedback on the results. But it still centers around building trust. And in the work setting and in the organization, if you look for opportunities to maybe, like you see, like your crash example, I've never done that. What the heck? You look for those opportunities and give people a chance, and you'd be amazed at what they're able to do a lot of times. And so you select those individuals by observations day in and day out. But then when opportunities show up, say, oh, I think Jim would do well at that. Like, here, Jim, I'm going to challenge you. Please go. And I realize I'm challenging you. So you have to have that dialogue. And I realize I'm challenging. I realize it's okay to not have all the answers. Come talk to me. In some cases, I won't have all the answers either, but I'll help you find them out. And that's part of that downfield blocking. But allow them the flexibility and opportunity to show what they can do. And so, to me, that's what I mean about trust.
Right. You mentioned something, that it's okay to fail.
Yeah.
Right. It's kind of hard to have innovation as a core value and not being willing to risk failure from time to time, right? Because how do you innovate?
Right.
Without risking failure.
Right.
So
yeah, and part of that is what is your reaction to failure? If someone makes a mistake in your organization, what's your reaction to that? Do you flip out, blame that person, or do you take some responsibility for that? After all, I think this is something leaders don't do often enough, is that Edward Demings, who's the father of quality management, says that every problem on the assembly line began in the boardroom. So as leaders, we've set up this environment that allowed this person to fail or to make a mistake, right? I mean, every once in a while, people do knucklehead decisions and they do dumb stuff, right? But more or less, what's your reaction? So if somebody makes a mistake, do you look at that person and blame them, or do you try to determine what is your role in encouraging that kind of mistake, and then how do we prevent that in the future? So was it a lack of training? Were the directions from the leadership not clear? Were the expectations not clear? There's lots of different things that could cause these kinds of mistakes and to prevent them in the future.
Right. Yeah, it goes back to success has many fathers, failure
Exactly.
one. Right.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Or the Harry Truman sign on the desk when he was president. The buck stops here.
You got it. Yeah.
Right.
Right.
So, all right. So, we talked about a lot of different things over this. So, any thoughts, tools, wisdom you'd like to share with the listeners?
Yeah, I was. I think we were at the same conference, the Sterling conference, not too long ago, and Tony Moore, who's a motivational speaker, came in, and he talked about how if you want to change the outcome, you got to change the culture.
Right.
Right. And I think it was Peter Drucker that says culture eats strategy for breakfast.
Right.
And so one of the things that Tony Moore suggested was to get with your leadership team and to ask them to give you feedback on what are the 3 things that they would like you to stop doing, what are the 3 things they would like you to continue doing, and what are the 3 things they would like you to start doing. And so I did that with my leadership team, and of course I gave them their feedback and then asked them for feedback as well. And it was really eye-opening, and it's the feedback that I got weren't these kind of big overall earth-shattering things, but it was kind of they were the things that were really the interpersonal
Right.
things that were important to them.
In words before we wrap up.
Yes. Yeah. To me, you're always on. Right? When
Yeah.
you're in a position of leadership,
Good point, yeah.
I'd say you are always on. In the military, right? It was easy because you wore a uniform and it showed who you were. Even when you weren't on base, you were out in the community. But understanding that how you interact with people, somebody's usually always watching. Right. And so use that as a self-governance check. You're on as a leader. It's not as it still comes back to introspective, right? But that if I were to suggest one thing is just realize you're always on. And so, and one aw shucks is very hard to recover from because it starts to erode. The big word we talk about is trust, right? And you have to go back and start building that brick once and again. And so that always on ties into I guess kind of ties into everything when it comes to leadership. You're now what was I trying to think about? Or about to say the how people react to you becomes important.
Right.
Yeah.
That's not any different than being a parent, right?
Right.
When do you get time off?
No,
you don't.
Never,
even once
yeah.
they graduate, they've gone to college. You're still the parent. You may have a lot less role, but you're still there, right? So you're always on.
Mm-hmm.
So as we wrap up, I'm kind of go through a lightning round. So it'll be,
Okay.
quick, funny, could just kind of give the listeners a little more sense of who we are, and
Okay.
I'll answer them too. So
Great.
So we'll get 3 answers. So start with tea or coffee.
Tea.
Coffee.
All right, got one of each. I'll go with coffee. So, would you want to live forever?
No.
No elves.
No.
Probably.
What's for dinner?
Oh, you didn't answer.
I don't want to be an elf.
Oh.
No, I don't want to live forever. Sorry, Lord of the Rings. Elf. So what's for dinner tonight?
I think my daughter is making Korean beef, Korean
Wow,
pork, something like
I'm
that.
coming over.
Come on over, man.
I've got a Chipotle burrito waiting for me in the refrigerator.
Ooh.
And I have leftovers. How about that?
That's not fair.
That's just tough luck. So, so what's the fastest speed you've ever driven a car?
Wow. Maybe 90, 95?
About 120.
I'll say I lived in Montana when they had no speed limits.
Let
But
her
the
rip.
fastest, yeah, let her rip. But the fastest I've driven a car was a friend had a brother who had a Porsche when I was in high school, and I think we got up to 140.
Wow.
Yeah.
So
I ran out of road when I got up to 120. Because
yeah, it was
Yeah.
probably really stupid, but yeah,
I wasn't in Montana. I was
Yeah.
in Georgia.
Yeah.
Again, high school, right?
right, high school.
Yeah.
So, Star Trek or Star Wars?
Star
Star
Trek.
Wars.
Okay, I heard a Trek, I heard a war.
Yeah.
I think the scientific mind would be Star Trek because it's more true to science than Star Wars, but they're both good. So,
Yeah, I like them both.
so
I prefer prefer the story better.
yeah.
That's all.
That's got to be the old time
I guess.
Star Trek.
So, big dogs or small dogs?
Big dogs.
Big.
Big.
Yeah.
Yeah, we got one of each. I like the small one better. So how about that? So, well, it's a little wiener dog, a little miniature wiener dog.
Oh, those
so,
are cute.
so how many hours of sleep do you need a night?
At least 8.
At least 8.
Oh, yeah.
The doctor recommends at least 8, right?
Yeah.
Need or
Need.
get?
Need is the question.
7-ish need. And I try to shoot for about 7-ish every night. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, 7 to 8, I think, is right. I think we all gave close to the doctor's recommended answer there.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, just in case they're watching.
just in case they're watching. Yeah. So, do you like the word dapper?
I do like the word dapper.
Yeah, I figured you'd like that,
Yeah.
Bob. You don't have your Star Wars tie on today, but
Not particularly.
no. Yeah, I don't know. I could do without it. So,
Yeah.
well, thank you both for joining us today, Erik, Bob. It was great for you being here and to have you both. I appreciate the conversation. Now, I want to, before we close, special thanks to our media relations team who made all this possible. We can't do it without them. And again, thank you, everyone out there listening or watching, for joining us for the second episode of Pasco Podcast. I'm Dan Biles, and until the next one, have a great day. Thank you.